Howdy, all of you delicious people. I'm here today to review the movie Love and Monsters. So, ultimately, going into this review, I will kind of break down how I kind of felt about this movie at first in a very cryptic like way and mentioning in way. And then eventually I will go into that double five sweet time and then go into spoiler territory. So, recently, going into this movie, we have it to where seemingly this movie, if you guys have ever played the video game Fallout, or if you guys have ever kind of watched the remake of Clash of the Titans, of course, when you have Liam Neeson yelling "Release the Kraken" and this and that and all that jazz, it kind of feels like this movie is mostly like a Fallout kind of movie, but then eventually has it to where there are these very much release the Kraken like moments, or like having a big, huge creature that would normally be big and huge. If anything, this movie very much reminds me of the Dwayne The Rock Johnson film, The Journey, or ultimately maybe the Brendan Fraser movie, like Journey to the Center of the Earth. Basically, you have a creature that normally wouldn't be that large, that is absurdly large, and then kind of slightly tweaked to where ultimately it would look much more menacing for reasons. So going into this movie, like that's kind of how I felt about it. It feels that this movie isn't all that really creative. It ultimately really spends too much time on focusing way too much on the story of the characters rather than okay, what's going to make this movie really different? And it never really quite exactly sells you on that. It really just kind of just it pops interesting things in every once in a while, but it's mostly just focused on a character that is self-narrating his story, and a bulk of this self-narrating story is a letter to a girl that ultimately he is going to try to find his way to. So this movie is probably just I think it should probably have just ended up a movie that you could obviously have easily seen in Prime or Amazon Prime, or just shoved onto Netflix somewhere, or just shoved onto some streaming service and for you to be able to eventually just see it for free. I don't think that this movie is worth going into a theater to see, if it even is that. Recently, right now, I think legitimately you can ultimately, I think, rent this movie for I think $20 on Amazon, and I don't think that is really worth that price, because ultimately I just don't think that this story is good enough. Um, I think Dylan O'Brien, who ultimately plays Joel in this movie, which is kind of a weird coincidence, because I share that same name. Ultimately, it seems kind of funny that Dylan O'Brien, aka Joel, is just he kind of plays a character that he has just consistently played. He never really goes out and and is really being much in a bubble of being anybody beyond like a really scared scared kid that eventually has to grow into um being much less fearful, and eventually has to really survive in this new environment. I do kind of like how they set this up and how they kind of give you a backstory of how these people had to forcibly go into these underground or very heavily fortified like shelters and stuff like that. Because there's kind of a mixture of certain ways that people kind of made it through this seemingly um, new world they live in. And yeah, when just kind of looking at this, it seems that the overall story is just kind of very, really, like, kind of half-aid, kind of half-assed. It just kind of just feels like, yeah, nobody really cares about how we got to this point. It's just like, wait till you see the goofy looking creatures that are barely different than any normal looking creatures that you've probably ever really seen in your life. And when looking at it, it just kind of, it's just like, it's a movie that isn't far enough different to be interesting enough. I think that's the whole thing about it. It really feels like a movie that is really on the cheap end. You can really tell the difference between the actors and when the monster is coming. You can really tell the difference between the graphics between the two. You can kind of immediately kind of really tell that we have our actor that is reacting to probably nothing. You can easily tell that, and it definitely reeks of that, sadly enough. Um, so that's all that I could really say for the most point of just it feels obvious that these people are reacting to nothing, or that it's just like it it doesn't like it kind of feels like a very just throwing this movie out there kind of attempt to ultimately just go, hey, maybe people love the word monster in a movie. And ultimately, maybe people might be jazzed that they might hear it's a love story. Ooh! This movie is just, yeah, it's just not that exciting enough, sadly enough. It's just not good enough quality. It feels like a Blumhouse film to me, which ultimately Michael Rooker has done the Fantasy Island movie, and that was just garbage to me. And so this movie just kind of feels like just barely okay enough to be okay. Um, which that is really like the lowest bar of okay that you can possibly be for a movie. Because I would rather just say that this is just a overall just really just right into that bad level of film, but it's just kind of in between okay and bad, to where it's just like just a thing to watch if you have nothing else to see. So ultimately, hopefully, they'll offer this up. They'll serve this up as a free thing for you to be able to see. Because ultimately, I think that's the real price of this movie is free. It doesn't feel like a movie you should go out of your way to pay for. So at the end of the day, um, if ultimately you don't want to pay your way through an Amazon, which justifiably I don't think you should, you can probably go through any number of movie apps, probably like a movie box or probably a movie pro that I've gone into and seen a lot of movies quite lately and kind of just bootleg this movie. A lot of people might just be bootlegging or pirating a lot of stuff at the end of the day. This is probably another movie to do that because this movie is just not quite there for you to care. It's brutally honest. So let's go into the spoilers about this movie. Let's get out that double five to otherwise tell you what goes on to this movie to really help you understand how and where I got to this conclusion. So reasonably we have it to where Joel is ultimately telling us about how this world got to be what it is. Because basically Joel has been in this underground like vault esh like uh underground bunker esh like thing, and they have been in there for a while. It seems like they have consistently been starting to get breaches of monsters coming through, coming in, and seemingly attacking them. So ideally we have it to where it seems that what had happened is that we had it to where ultimately there had been finally aliens that had landed onto Earth. And so we immediately had it to where it seemed like the government had tried to attack these aliens with nuclear weapons. And so the aftermath of a nuclear war with aliens ends up being a planet that ends up being completely destroyed, um, if you want to say, environmentally changed or environmentally shifted, uh, to where this explanation seems very murky and very like, what the heck is what's going on. That is what this story really is. It's like a thing that they just kind of just farted together and it makes no sense, but that is just the explanation that it tries to otherwise give you. We ultimately have it to where it shows some pre bomb dropping things happening at some points within this movie. We ultimately find that Joel had a girlfriend named Amy, and it seems that they were split apart because ultimately Amy had to go and take care of some family, and Joel had to not forcibly, but Joel had to of course go with his parents to try to otherwise uh, make it out of here. But it seems like his parents didn't exactly make it. So ultimately, we have it to where Joel is into this vault and consistently via radio talking to Amy. It seems like a lot of these underground Esh like places or anywhere that they have these underground like places for people. It seems like they're all connected via radios, and so ultimately we have Joel that kind of doesn't really have like really much to really do within this underground bunker. Basically, he is either just to make sure the radio is working or figure out how to make some kind of food. And it seems like he has only one kind of specialty. It seems like he has people that are very much in mid relationships, and so he is consistently hearing them because ultimately, like, the walls are very thin, let's just say, in this underground like place. So ultimately, when people are going at it, we can basically have it to where Joel can hear absolutely everything. So we have it to where Joel ultimately has a best friend that is called Maeve or Mavis. Ultimately, this Mavis is ultimately just some robot that doesn't even work. And so ultimately, from time to time, it seems that Joel talks to this thing, but it never actually talks back. So ultimately, we have it to where we are told that Joel is kind of awful at anything but making food and doing the radio. It seems like there are some people that end up going out in the world to try to scavenge for stuff and come back. Um, but I guess when they end up going out and coming back, eventually they usually bring something in with them. Just because that's the nature of these things, these giant monsters that are usually some kind of insect, some kind of toad, frog, uh, crab, lobster looking thing that is morphed into a much larger, abnormally large um, creature monster esh like thing that at the end of the day is just like, okay, sure. Yeah, like whatever you can kind of figure out can just shove out there and just be a different ash looking thing at the end of the day. So going into this movie, basically we have to where Joel is confronted with one of the monsters who had breached in, and it looks very much like an insect like monster. It seems like he's confronted with this, and ultimately he's a person that is not. He ultimately has a crossbow in hand, but is not pulling the trigger because Joel is basically a person that chokes, or when or ultimately is a person that can't really fire a crossbow all that well anyways. So we basically just have it to where Joel is realizing how worthless he is within this underground bunker, and he basically tells all these people that he is basically useful to them, and then they kind of confirm to him. It's like, well, yeah, no, like you're not really that useless. You can do the radio and make one meal. So ultimately, he's like, wow, that really gets me really jazzed. So Joel has decided to eventually try and find Amy. Ultimately, try to reach out to her and ultimately try to find her. So ultimately, they can finally be together, and ultimately, eventually, seemingly get married or something of where this new world is going into now. So, and ultimately, the girl that ends up playing Amy is the girl from Iron Fist that ends up being infatuated with the Iron Fist character. So I'm like, wow, these actors are just man. The casting choice is just kind of not at a real true bar that I'm really getting excited about the more and more I watch this movie. It just seems like a lot of like either first time Ash like people or a lot of people that don't exactly have had a real true blue like litany of acting experience besides Michael Rooker. But it seems like Michael Rooker, after kind of like after pretty much doing The Walking Dead, like his like stuff, his projects are kind of getting like a little bit smaller and smaller and smaller to where it's gonna get to the point to where some of the Michael Rooker jobs that he's doing are just kind of getting to the point of almost relevancy, which is sad to say. Um, but ultimately, probably Michael Rooker and his little daughter in this movie, the person that plays his daughter, is probably the most interesting thing about this movie and isn't placed within this entire film, which I think is stupid. So we have it to where Joel just decides, hey, I'm peacing out, I'm leaving, I'm gonna go and go out of my way to try to find Amy. So Joel goes on the radio and tells Amy that he's coming for her, and so basically Joel goes out of his way to start to journey into being on the outside world. And so what ends up happening is, of course, we have it to where at first that Joel ends up kind of like just kind of jaunting around, and then eventually there's a monster that eventually has to come out of the woodwork to attack him. At first, this is very like mute. This is a giant mutated frog that ends up attacking said Joel, and eventually, while trying to face this, frog, and eventually we have it to where um, we have Joel who meets Boy, which is actually a dog. Ultimately, we find out that these giant frogs are actually afraid of dogs. Maybe because it rhymes. So the dog shows up, ultimately scaring the frog, and the frog leaps away. And then ultimately, Joel is a person that is consistently drawing all kinds of sketches of what every single creature looks like. So every time that they see a creature, he sketches it, and he sketches really well to showcase what these creatures actually look like and to ultimately mention their weaknesses or what is the best way to kill them and stuff like that. So ultimately, we have it to where this dog boy ultimately has this special dress that he like wants to keep with him, and I just don't know why. Justifiably, there is not one reason for why this dress is important to Boy, and I guess it's just a relevant thing. It's some random thing that this dog just loves for reasons I don't understand. And so eventually the Joel tries to get the dress away from Boy, and ultimately Boy won't let him. So ultimately, reasonably, it seems that they both for a time end up just kind of just sharing a bus with one another. And so eventually Joel, because I guess out of that rousing like attack going on with that frog, ultimately he needed to rest shortly thereafter. So we get it to where more and more it seems that eventually we get to where these monsters keep like appearing out of seemingly nowhere, or ultimately seemingly out of left field at some point. So we have it to where Joel accidentally falls into this hole, and ultimately it seems like there is some kind of worm-esh like creature that is underneath the ground. And so there's kind of little ash like worm creatures that are seeming to attack Joel. He ends up knocking them all off, but it seems like there's a bigger like insectual underground monster that I guess shows himself upon later. And because ultimately we have it to where it seems that Michael Rooker and Minnow, I don't know. Uh, Adrian Greenblatt, ultimately Michael Rooker's daughter, I believe. So I'm going to say Minnow for the rest of this time now, and I'm probably pronouncing it wrong. Um, so ultimately, Michael Rooker's character is called Clyde, and so ultimately, we have it to where ultimately Michael Rooker is throwing a rope down to Joel, and he ends up getting scared by it. And Clyde says, "Hey, it's a rope, you dummy! Like, crawl up, climb up it, because ultimately, like, this monster is gonna get you." So ultimately, Joel ends up climbing up the rope, and ultimately they're like desperately saying, "Hey, like, we need to get out of here." But while they're trying as much as possible to get out of there, they like ultimately Michael Rooker is asking for this guy's name and asking like, "Hey, where's the people that you were with?" And ultimately Joel explains that like um he had left the place that he was at. He left the bunker, or the underground bunker that he was in. And ultimately Michael asks him, it's like, "Well, did you steal food from them?" And he's like, "No, I didn't steal food, I just left." It's like, if anything, I'm heading this direction to go and meet my girlfriend. And so they're basically like, "Well, hey, she better be worth it if you're going to be trying to you're going to be making your way to her, and like, you must really love her that much to go and find her." So we end up finding out or we end up finding that these monsters, once they get a scent on a person, eventually they come back around to try and find them. So these things have some kind of like scent to where ultimately they will come back around to get whoever they were trying to get earlier. So Michael Rooker is really warning Joel that like eventually like this thing is going to come for us, so like we need to keep moving. So ultimately, while trying to survive in this new world, like Michael Rooker is breaking down some rules for him to understand, but then also Joel is actually giving Rooker sketches of some monsters that he might have not actually seen or ultimately has seen, and ultimately telling him, yeah, um, like Clyde is telling Joel that, hey, if you shoot him in the head, like that works perfectly fine to take down this monster. So and also he had told him about some other monster as well, that if you see it, like if you can probably look it in the eyes, you can tell a lot about this monster. So we have it to where Joel is very much learning the rules, and this is kind of breaking down to be very much like Zombieland, bizarrely, to where it's like you have to have a bunch of rules that some experienced person has to lay down to you, and basically they keep going through and lighting a fire and making a hot meal, uh, and then ultimately eventually going to sleep. But the only thing is that Clyde tells Joel that you can only get one thing. You can either get a very hot meal, or you can get a good portion of sleep. So immediately we have it to where consistently, because what happens is if because when Clyde and them all make a hot meal, eventually the monsters will eventually come to them and find them somewhere in the middle of the night. And so reasonably it ends up being that, yeah, you can make a hot meal, but when looking at it, eventually all the other monsters will also uh, eventually get a whiff of that hot meal and come for not only your hot meal, but also for you. So it ends up being that these people can only sleep like a couple hours, and then eventually Clyde wakes them up, um, to ultimately tell them, okay, like this is as much sleep as you're gonna get. So we have it to where reasonably Joel is like consistently complaining about the lack of sleep that he's getting. It's like, well, that's what happens when you don't have like you have very small numbers, but on top of that, it's like you're basically gonna have to keep adjusting from place to place to place. So ultimately, like, here's my thing. Why is it that they couldn't just like stay someplace, eat the hot meal, and then after that, like kind of just mosey on down to a further location and then eventually take a place to sleep? I think it's just one of those where it's kind of really showcasing that these people, whether surviving in this place, had to have a very much lack of sleep consistently, um, in order to consistently stay alive. So, justifiably, we have it to where more and more Joel seems to be learning about the ways of being a survivalist out in the wild and to survive within a week within this new world. And with there consistent being times of monsters consistently on their lurch coming at them, and ultimately while Joel at some point tries to swim through this water and getting leeches all over his body, um because he ultimately has to go and get a boy who has to stubbornly go after this dress in this water. So we have it to where within this movie we have it to where Minnow, or the Clyde's daughter, is teaching Joel how to use a crossbow. And it seems like Joel is taking a very long time to try to learn this, but then eventually he does it so well that it seems like he eventually gets pretty near perfect accuracy. It just takes a while. And so eventually we get it to where it seems that his pinpoint accuracy is going to come into a factor once he separates himself from Clyde and his daughter. So ultimately we have it to where like it seems that these people get to know about one another. It seems that Clyde's daughter is very much starting to really very much like Joel, or really much like hug him and all this other stuff. And like Clyde is just like looking at them. It's like, well, hey, it looks like you two are just kind of like really the best of friends. Because at first, I think like she would just call him dumb or that. She would just be mad at him because he was very ignorant or didn't know any better. But now that he's willing to really want to try and be really good at all of this stuff and not really complain about the stuff that they all had to do, and because ultimately he just went with the flow of things. He never went against the grain, which ultimately I think that's why they kept together for so long. So we have it to where ultimately Clyde and his daughter and eventually Joel have to split their ways, because ultimately they kind of go to him to eventually where he is supposed to go to find this girl. And so eventually they split ways. And like, that's the kind of sad thing, because I'm like, you know what? Like, why couldn't they have all just stayed together? Because I think the best part about this movie was Michael Rooker and his daughter being tied with Joel. And I think that this relationship should have been done through this entire movie. I think would have been way better off. But I just think that overall, like, it should have been like put throughout this entire film, or in some ways they would have like Han Solo come back and um helped Joel at the very end of this. But I don't know. It could have been a little bit better that way, and I think the relationship should have been cemented through this entire time and this and that. We ultimately eventually before or right before we end up like because we're getting we're getting Joel to be very close to Amy. And so when Clyde and his daughter go into the separate ways, it's not like they leave him right at the door and say okay bye. Like, he still has some miles to track up to getting to her. And so while that happens, we also have a bunch of monsters that appear. Eventually, Joel has to really take on this big, seemingly insect-like, like centipede-ish, like I don't know my insects, like a very big centipede-ish like creature, and he ultimately pops that thing in the head and kills it. Ultimately, he also fights this also very big ash like worm monster, where he ultimately throws a grenade into this monster's mouth and kills it via that. And we also have it to where Joel is making his way to Amy, and he eventually is kind of going through this one portion of seemingly a desecrated like town that is like homes, but they're kind of really disheveled, and they have like a bunch of like plant life all around them. So eventually, like, Joel is starting to like scavenge through this little place, and eventually he realizes that there's a Mavis there that ultimately is actually operational, but it's operational for a very short time, like 15 to 20-ish like minutes. And so ultimately he's like, oh my god, I've never actually seen one of you actually work before, and like, this is amazing. And so basically we have this Mavis that is ultimately like talking to him and trying to figure some things out. And so also this Mavis is also showcasing photos of Joel's parents, because ultimately I guess she probably like picked them off of some social media, and and a bulk of his family. And so Joel is so excited about that because he couldn't have any pictures of any number of his family. It was too late for that. So he gets to see photos from Mavis's head of photos of his family, and so he's like, "Oh my god, like this is great, this is amazing." And so ultimately, what ends up happening is before Mavis starts to lose power, they both go outside, and ultimately, there's a bunch of jellyfish that are seemingly flying around into the air. Ultimately, Mavis tells Joel that these jelly flying fish, whatever like things, are not an actual threat. They're just kind of floating around. So Mavis is asking Joel if he would like some music. He says yes. So for the remaining time, she plays a song while ultimately he's watching seemingly jellyfish flying in the air, and he's remarking about how like sometimes um, this world is actually pretty beautiful if you can get past the like murder, death, and destruction, actually like things of it. So eventually, Maeve runs out her power and then just dies. So justifiably, Joel buries Mavis, and that's bizarrely what he does. So eventually, we get it to where we then, after Joel buries Mavis, eventually he goes and head to Amy's um, Amy's place, because ultimately they really just really find him, because here's what happens. So ultimately, like I said, we have it to where Joel is kind of fighting a bunch of monsters, and then eventually Boy ends up going through the water with his dress, and Joel tries to uh, go with him because he's Boy is his best friend. So ultimately, uh, all of these lesions go into his body, and so he has to pick every single one of them off. He finds out, or he realizes that a lot of these legions that came onto his body are all very poisonous, and so eventually he is like thinking that he's going to die soon, because ultimately he's just like, whoa. So we have it to where, bizarrely, Joel ends up falling over, and he ultimately remembers something that Clyde had told him, that there is a plant that ultimately slows down and or stops poison being put through people. So we have it to where Joel tries to grab this plant and tries to eat it. So I guess that kind of quasi slows down the process of him being poisoned. So eventually we have it to where Joel eventually is supposedly being saved by Amy, or what I guess you would think is Amy, but I don't think that is actually Amy. I think it's something that he's just dreaming or fantasizing about. So, because ultimately what ends up happening is there is another person that Joel ends up kissing, and it's not actually Amy, because someone else finds him and tries to to get him back to their to their place. So Joel ends up passing out and then waking up within this seemingly underground-ish like hospital. Ultimately, we end up finding out that Amy is like realizing that, oh, you're awake now, Joel, you're awake, and eventually tells him that he had kissed someone who wasn't her and was some other guy, and he shows himself and then leaves. So Amy ultimately is kind of like asking, it's like, well, hey, how did you make it here? Like, what all happened? And ultimately, Joel is trying to tell him the whole Joel is trying to tell her the whole story about everything that he had saw, all the monsters and like everything else, and just every like that he had a dog, and that he met people and this and that. So and that he had saw Mavis that ultimately worked and this and that. And ultimately he tries to tell all this stuff to also his people at his other bunker that had gotten breached quite frequently. And so, because ultimately he eventually gets the radio and eventually tells him about his story. So, we have it to where it seems that Amy had been taking care of a lot of elderly people. It seems like a bulk of the people that were there were all really just elderly people, but then eventually Amy mentions that there is a guy that owns a yacht that is seemingly going to take them away from all this and like transport them elsewhere. So we have it to where we find uh, this guy that I think they call like Captain Yacht or something like that, or Yacht Captain or whatever. And ultimately, Joel is like, "Why is he the yacht captain?" It's like, "Because he has a yacht, stupid." So eventually, we have it to where Joel meets this yacht captain, and it seems that at first everything seems copacetic. It seems like this yacht captain is like mentioning, it's like, well, hey, uh, yeah, we have been trying to survive out in the waters, and man, it's been really crazy. But you know what? It's like I think everything's going really well. And so ultimately, he's seeing how Joel has been out in the wild for seemingly a week, and it's like, well, wow, like if anything, we can do just as well as you did out in the wild for a week, like we could really use a man like you. And so we have it to where at first this yacht captain is very convincing. Seems like they're all having a party, everything's hurrah hurrah. But then Joel is realizing and starting to think, you know what? This isn't all it's cracked up to be. Because ultimately, Joel goes to Amy and ultimately is telling her his real true feelings, that he loves her, and he came back to tell her that he loves her. And Amy is ultimately breaking down to him, telling him, it's like, you know what? It's great that you went all this way for me, but like, you honestly remind me of my past, and ultimately realizing about all the people that I had lost, and that ultimately I don't know if I can really love you, because reasonably, like, you just remind me of everything that I've lost, and this and that, and I'm not really quite sure if ultimately, like, we can really be together. And plus also I'm just kind of really um I've already lost one person that I've grown to love via this time that I've now been in this new Ash like world. And Joel is like, "Oh my god, I am so stupid for like pretty much trekking all my way up here to get to you." Because ultimately, like, he never really asked her if like he should come up here or that he should come for her or whatever. So it ends up that Amy doesn't really seem like at first really all that into him. So ultimately, Joel is easily deciding to otherwise just going, you know what? I'm just gonna go back to my. I'm just gonna go back to my people. I'm gonna go back to my clan and just really just go back with them. Considering like Amy's not really that into me, like I'm peacing out. I'm deucing. So what ends up happening is that we have to where ultimately the yacht captain is like, well, hey, like if you're leaving tomorrow to ultimately go back to your old crew, like we'll have a party, we'll have a send off, we'll give you some food, and like, hey man, like all is copacetic. Like, hey man, come on, like let's party it up, and then ultimately we'll leave the next day. So ultimately, what ends up happening is that is that Joel gets this big bowl of strawberries and ultimately gets like a drink. And so all of a sudden, Joel is kind of really like thumbing through and thinking about this whole yacht captain thing and how like does he can he really trust this yacht captain with Amy and all these people, and like a lot of things that he's saying he's kind of thumbing around on. Like it is kind of funny when ultimately when Joel comes to the yacht captain and basically he asks like, hey, well, where's your other crew? And Joel said that he had left him. Again, they go with the same consensus of that, well, hey, did you steal food? And Joel's like, no, why does everyone say that? And so everything about these people start to seem very like just kind of very like rubbing Joel the wrong way. It seems like they have a barrage of weapons. It seems like a lot of stuff is just not quite coming in his mind to really be trustworthy. And so eventually he almost takes a bite of this strawberry, but then looks at it and he's like, you know what? Like, I remember Clyde telling me about a strawberry that looks very much like this one. It's like a strawberry, but it has like a blue tint to it, or blue, like kind of like it's a a half strawberry, half blueberry looking like thing. And so ultimately, Joel had said that these strawberries are very poisonous. And so ultimately, Joel is like, yeah, they were feeding me poison to try to kill me. So ultimately, I wouldn't go back to my people and talk about this yacht captain. So Joel ultimately is now grabbing Amy to ultimately convince her that something's horribly awry with this yacht captain. But the only problem is everyone is far too drunk, because ultimately this beer had kind of probably been laced with something to knock everyone out. So, or all their food were probably laced with some kind of stuff and drugs to knock them all out. So it ends up being that Joel is trying to convince Amy about this stuff, and she's not really coherent enough to understand any of this. And eventually she drops, and so then eventually the yacht captain drops Joel. So ultimately, we find out the truth that this yacht captain has ultimately just been going from place to place and pirating from people, which, of course, since he has a boat, I guess he's a pirate. So he's a person that's just going through consistently and trying to steal things from people and seeming like he's going to take them on his boat, but really he's just going to go and kill them off at some point. Because realistically, his boat, once they started to run out of like boat fuel or whatever to do this boat, ultimately what they ended up doing was they ended up forcing one of the sea creatures to ultimately push their boat around. So ultimately they had it to where this big crab ends up coming from out under the yacht to ultimately showcase itself to come on land to ultimately start attacking these people. And ultimately, the entire time, the yacht captain has a finger on this trigger to ultimately keep electrocuting the crab, to do what they want. So it ends up that really like Amy is now awake and starting to realize that she's going to try and take down these yacht captains, because if anything, Amy now appreciates that Joel went 7 days to try to get to her, and basically now, even so much more so than now, protect her. She is realizing how valuable Joel is, and so she's like, well, hey, if you took 7 days to get to me, I'm gonna go and take out these three guys. So she tries to take down these three goons and doesn't really quite seem to exactly work. Uh, it seems like she shields herself and eventually starts attacking people. So it just kind of ends up that we have it to where this crab eventually comes up to um, attack these people, and so eventually Joel goes out of his way to try to find some like weapons, like trident-esh looking things, to attack said crab. And so reasonably, it ends up that this crab ends up holding Joel upside down, and ultimately Joel is in a possession of a weapon. But then, like, it's slowly starting to like Joel is slowly starting to realize that this crab is is very much not really wanting to actually hurt them. And so, because reasonably, Joel looks at the crab's eyes and realizes that this crab is not really wanting to do any of this stuff. So, as soon as Joel notices the chain that this crab is tied to, ultimately we have it to where we have Clyde's words telling Joel about this crab that you can again like see within its eyes what it wants to do. So Joel ends up shooting not the crab, he ends up shooting the chain that the crab is connected to. And so immediately we have all the villainish, piratish people that are all back onto the yacht. And so the giant crab makes his way back to the yacht to devour, eat, and take down every single one of these people that were on this yacht, and then eventually just swim away. Ultimately, at the end of the day, it's really just to have it to just be like, yeah, this crab is gonna get his revenge on these bad people that end up doing poor like crap. So everybody's just so happy that Joel at the end of the day just saved them all, but eventually Joel is still very much wanting to eventually go back to his people. But it seems as if though eventually he's going to make his way back to Amy because he like it seems like they um, could quite possibly have a relationship, but it's probably something that they probably need to very much work on, I guess, which seems very odd. So we have it to where ultimately Joel ends up going back to his people and ultimately coming to the decision that, you know what, like this place has been breached way too often. So I think it's time now for us to like try to otherwise find a place that we can really and truly survive. Because Clyde had told Joel that ultimately, if you go up to the mountains, it seems like the monsters attack very much fewer. So ultimately, Joel is coming up with that same consensus that ultimately he wants to um, make his way up to this. Well, he wants to make his way up to these mountains as well, because ultimately Clyde had told him that the monsters attack fewer. So basically, like Joel is completely tying himself onto thinking that what Clyde had told him was the honest to God truth. So we end up finding out that while we have Joel's final narration of telling people what is all going on, this like really just one last real story to tell everybody. It seems that we find out that Clyde and Minnow are at this place making their way up to get to the mountains, and they're finding out that there is a bunch of spiders uh, that are on their way there to make it to the. There's like a ton of spiders evidently around that place. So that is just kind of how the movie ends with like a cliffhanger-ish like thing where Clyde and Minnow are trying to make it up to the mountains, but evidently they might be forded or they might be slowly stopped by spider ash like creatures. And so ultimately, at the end of the day, I think that's all I'm really going to say about this movie. It probably took too long to review it, but at the end of the day, I'm going to get out of here. Bye, everybody. Bye, everybody.